business to attend to tonight. Our fame has spread, and we're being asked to go places and do things. I had a call today from the Harrisburg Symphony, and on Sunday, June 6th, at 3 o'clock in the Forum, they are going to have a D-Day 60th anniversary concert with military music, patriotic music from World War II, and they've invited all you gray heads, not us kids, but all you World War II vets are invited to come free. So if any of you want to go up there, it's at the Forum in Harrisburg, up there.
What's that date?
Sunday, June 6th.
What's the time?
3 o'clock. And all you need to do is identify yourself as a World War II veteran, and you're in there. The other thing, I had a call today, and believe it or not, Governor Rendell has heard of us. And on July 4th, they're having the Let Freedom Ring ceremony on the steps of the Capitol. Did any of you see a story on that? They've put some publicity out on it already. Anyway, they would like World War II veterans from our Capital Area World War II Roundtable to lead the Pledge to Allegiance to start the ceremony. So any of you fellas that are interested in that, let me know and give me your names, and I'll get you the details on it. The program starts, July 4th. It starts at 1 o'clock, and they project that they'll be doing the Pledge of Allegiance at 1:27 p.m. And apparently it's going to be pretty neat. They're expecting between 3,000 and 5,000 people. They're going to have a couple of flyovers. And, it's a July 4th patriotic event. And they want to honor World War II veterans. And Governor Rendell, I had a call from one of his people today that he'd heard of our group and said for me to ask tonight, any of you fellows want to come up there, they'd like to have as many of you as can come to lead the pledge of the flag. I have another gentleman's here tonight, Eric Epstein is in the back there, and he is working, I think some of you fellows have already recorded your stories for PCN for their World War II Veterans Series. I know there's at least one fellow here who has. But Eric, you want to come up and tell them about your project and what they're doing?
Well, I made the mistake of coming to the meeting last time, and if you remember, I'm a professor of Holocaust Studies at Penn State. I no longer teach there, but I coordinated an oral history program there for Holocaust survivors and liberators. So Dean Dunkel, who's here, is guilty also. Together with Dean Dunkel, Charlie Brill, Ralph Fink, and the former Adjutant General Lynch, we started getting together after the last meeting because I was foolish enough to stand up and speak at one of these, which hopefully I won't have to do again. At any rate, within the last month, just to let you know what we've done, PCN is launching their what's known as Phase 5 of their oral history tapings. I have sign-up sheets in the back, and they're willing to focus on us first, which is a tremendous opportunity. And I don't know if you've seen the PCN histories. They're really, really good. If we had to go out and hire the folks, get the equipment, I need to tell you, I'm sure you know, Larry, it is a hassle and it's a lot of work. So any of you that are interested, please sign up tonight. We'll get a hold of you. We'll do the taping. We can come to your home or you can come to us however you want to do it. But, I don't want to be really fatalistic here, but it's important that we capture your memory now. The other thing I wanted to let you know is we met with the Pennsylvania Historic Museum Commission. Any of you that have memorabilia, and I think this is a problem we've all confronted and don't know what to do with it, the Pennsylvania Historic and Museum Commission has agreed to take it and file it in the state archives. And what I'm saying to you is, whether it's medals, stars and stripes, anything from the war that you want to preserve, they're willing to do it. So I'll stay afterwards. There's a sign-up sheet in the back. I'd like to acknowledge Dean. Dean, could you stand for a second? Dean was really helpful. He's never picked up the tab once, but and he can eat. I don't care. They can have gray hair. They can still eat. That's one thing I learned real quickly. But at any rate, also like to thank General Lynch has been really helpful, as has Governor Rendell, who I was able to kind of nudge. So at any rate, we'll be back there. I'll stay afterwards. And please, if you know anybody who wants to sign up, let's do it now, because this is a great opportunity that may not come again. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Believe it or not, we have a treasurer's report tonight. So you've seen me pocketing that money every month, and I really didn't take it and go to Philadelphia.
Okay.
So our treasurer, Patty Jobray. Do I say Captain?
No, close enough. Okay, we haven't done anything in the form of treasury until this month, so now I will do this formally every month, and then you'll all know where we stand. I deposited $514.81, and that goes back to September when we first started. Then we last month deposited $62.36. We took out $116.71 for the postage, so that you get your postcards, okay? And we have a total of $460.48 for the organization.
Thanks, Pat. Okay, and since we've got some money in the bank, our Vice President, Jack Thomas, would like to make a pitch here.
I recognize some faces from the Hershey Civil War Roundtable here, and I know that those people know that Hershey Civil War Roundtable has about 3 different subscriptions which they get for the library. It's intended for the patrons, plus also it's intended for our young people here in town as far as a resource. Civil War Times, Blue and Gray Magazine, Civil War News. Well, I know that some of you probably already get this as a subscription, but for the students and also for the townspeople who don't, I thought that talking to the library and our roundtable funding World War II magazine might be a good aspect, not only for providing a resource for the library, but also we get, you notice that it's donated from the Capital Area World War II Roundtable. Maybe we can also help get the word out and maybe get some of our young students here or some of the other patrons of the library.
Okay. Can I have a motion that we get a subscription for the Hershey Library?
I second it.
It's moved and seconded. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Okay, thank you. I think we made it on that. All right. Our speakers tonight, we get 2 for the price of 1. The one who's going to be doing most of the talking, it was with great reluctance that I asked him to come. But his name is Bill Williams, William Williams, and Bill and I worked together on the same newspaper 43 years ago on the Clearfield Progress up in Clearfield. But Bill's been in the newspaper business or in the writing business most of his life. He started on the Scranton Times, I guess it was when you were in high school, Bill. And then he went down to Reading, and then he married a girl from Clearfield and foolishly moved up there. But that's where I'm from. And he was up there in the Progress for a number of years in Clearfield, and then he came down to Harrisburg with the Associated Press, and then he got tied in with the politicians up there on the Hill. And I guess, what was it, Bill? The Republican, you were with the Republican speaker in the speaker's office, and he was the guy that wrote all the speeches and releases for them. But now that he's got gray hair and he's retired, he started writing books. The first one he wrote was about the Civil War, Days of Darkness, the Civilians at Gettysburg. Some of you may have heard of that. It's in, I think, its 3rd printing now. But Bill, like me, had as much interest in World War II and the period of his own service that I did. He did a book on, actually a novel, on the Coral Sea, the USS Coral Sea, which he served on in the Navy. And then along the way, he met a guy named Harry Fritz. And Harry was a tail gunner in a B-24 and was shot down over that garden spot called Ploesti and was a POW. And Bill helped Harry write his book. Harry said that if I let him up here, he wouldn't quit talking for 2 hours. So I'm going to ask Bill to speak first, and then we can bring Harry into it, and then we can bring Harry in for questions and answers. William.
maybe less than that. I was speaking to a group of sixth graders at a middle school about the Civil War. And one of the questions I got afterwards was, did you serve in the Civil War? I never thought I looked that old. I was 10 years old when World War II ended. I was out of high school 3 weeks, and the North Koreans heard that our class was coming, so they gave up. So I missed that one, and by the time Vietnam came around, I was married, had kids, and too old to go. You know, I think what this group here tonight is all about is remembering and honoring, too. Honoring what the greatest generation did. If not for people like you in this organization and others like it, the memory of World War II would be found only in the history books. Shortly after the war, Eleanor Roosevelt made a statement. She said, "We have to remember that in the future we will want to keep before our children what this war was really like. It is so easy to forget. For the younger generation, the heroism and the glamour remain, while the dirt, the hardships, the horror of death and sorrow fade somewhat from their consciousness." I'm afraid that too many young people today are becoming immune to the history of such horrors, whether it's World War II or the Civil War or any war, because I think they spend too much time playing make-believe video games that, from what I'm told, are sometimes very vicious, and also watching a lot of lousy television. And I think that immunity can only be punctured by studying the past on one hand, or facing the real thing. And I think we can agree that's a reality that you and I hope our kids and grandkids and future generations never really have to face. I think you have to face danger to realize the horror. You have to see and hear and smell and suffer to know what combat really is. Nobody can tell you exactly what passes through your mind or your spirit when you're faced with destruction. It has to be a been there, done that experience. And those of you gentlemen here tonight who have been there and done that, I think know the truth of that statement. Soldiers and Marines and airmen and sailors realize the truth of that. Listen to these words of one veteran. He said, "It is well that war is so terrible, else we should grow too fond of it." The speaker, as some of you may know, was General Robert E. Lee, and the occasion was that awful carnage at Fredericksburg in 1862. And this from another Civil War leader, General William T. Sherman, who said, "War is at best barbarism. It is only those who have neither fired a shot nor heard the shrieks and groans of the wounded, who cry aloud for blood, more vengeance, more desolation." Personally speaking, and I don't want to get into politics, but I think those words could fit the political situation in Washington today. And knowing what is past helps us to decide the future. Winston Churchill once said, "The farther backward you can see, the farther forward you'll be able to see." World War II veterans do not talk about the glamour, nor do they claim to be heroes, but the public knows them to be uncommon men and women, filled perhaps with fear, but willing to carry on through the mud and the blood, or across the flak-filled sky, or on the ever uncertain ocean. When we talk about war, any war, there is much more going on than the battles. How about the civilians who lie in the path of the war machine as it grinds across the landscape? I saw a 1944 photograph recently of a little French girl, perhaps 3 or 4 years old, with tears running down her cheeks from fearful eyes that were glued to the face of a U.S. Army medic who was bandaging her head? How about the military supply people and the clerks and others in rear areas, keeping the troops on the front lines supplied with the necessities of life? How about people back home, perhaps rejected for military service? My father volunteered for duty the day after Pearl Harbor. He was almost 38 years old, and he had recently left coal mining because of an accident after about 24 years underground. They told him he was too old. But he was proud that 3 of his younger brothers, still back home in Great Britain, were in the British forces, one in the Royal Navy, one in the RAF, and one in the British Army. But my dad said he still needed to do something during the war. And what he did in his spare time was drive a truck to pick up Red Cross supplies. All of these people served or suffered too. The poet Walt Whitman, speaking about America in the 1860s, said that the real war was not just the fighting, but the effect of that fighting on everyone, military and civilian alike. I recently read a book entitled Ernie's War. It's a selection of columns written between 1942 and 45 by perhaps the best well-known and famous war correspondent, Ernie Pyle. Pyle had a knack, as you know, of telling the story of World War II through the eyes of individuals. He wrote about individual soldiers. He was there, and he walked the walk. As you know, Ernie Pyle was killed by a Japanese sniper in the last few months of the Pacific Campaign. From Italy in February of 44, Pyle wrote this. He said, of the nearly 200 men who came overseas in the company I'm with now, only 8 are left. They have all been in the Army nearly 3 years. They have been away from America for 2 years. They have served in Algeria, Tunisia, and Italy. They have been at it so long that they have become truly more soldier than civilian. One of the men left in that company was a construction worker named Jack Pearson from Iowa, who was married, had 3 kids at home. But when he left home, his wife was pregnant with that 3rd child. And when that child was born, they called him Junior. The baby now was 2 years old. Pearson was still in the European theater. He'd been wounded once, and he talked more about Junior to his buddies than anything else. It was Junior this, Junior that. And perhaps it was because he had never seen his son and was thinking perhaps he never would. One day in a tough firefight, Jack Pearson was pinned down by German rifle and mortar fire. One of his buddies within shouting distance yelled, "How you doing, Jack?" And that tough construction worker turned fighting infantryman called back, perhaps with a tear in his eye, it don't look like I'm ever going to see Junior. The story had a happy ending. Jack Pearson did survive the war and did come home and see Junior. Pyle also told a story of men from other countries, like the day he was with a group of American soldiers checking out a recent battlefield. And on that field were 2 wrecked British fighter planes, one of which was upside down on the ground. One of the men with them looked through a small hole in the fuselage of that plane, and he saw a face. The pilot was still inside, upside down, still strapped in the cockpit. His feet disappeared into the instrument panel. The canopy below him was crushed, and it was obvious that the only way for him to get out was to have somebody cut through the metal side. Well, Pyle peeked in and said, "What do you say to a guy like that?" He said, "Are you all right?" And in typical British stiff upper lip, the reply came back, "Yes, quite, now that you chaps are here." Pyle asked him what happened. Pilot said he was on a night mission when ground fire hit and killed his engine. He was too close to the ground to bail out, so he turned on his landing lights to attempt a belly landing. Well, with the lights on, he really became a target for anybody on the ground. And the second shot hit him in the leg. Then a 3rd bullet cut across the fingers of his right hand and clipped every one of them to the bone. The plane, riddled with shrapnel, slid up a slight hill and then flipped over, trapping this man inside. Piles asked him, how long you been laying in there? And the guy didn't know. He says, well, I've been in and out of consciousness. He said, I've kind of lost track of time. And he says, but I do know that the day I was shot down, and when he told Ernie Pyle the date, Pyle says, good God, that was 8 days ago. During that time, the pilot said he had neither food nor water, and he was upside down in the cockpit, still strapped into his harness. It took them about an hour to cut through the metal and get him out. His left leg was broken and punctured by flak, and his foot was pinned under the rudder bar, and his back was terribly burned by raw gasoline, which had flowed down into the plane after the crash. Pyle said later that the space was so small inside that the pilot could not squirm around to relieve his own weight from his burned back. He couldn't even straighten out his legs, which were bent above him, and he could not see out of his little prison. Pyle said, yet when we found him, his mind was as calm and rational as though he were sitting in a London club. He was in agony, yet in his correct Oxford accent, he even apologized for taking up our time to cut him out. One of the soldiers who helped rescue the pilot, as the work progressed, said, God, these Liveys have got a lot of guts. At the time, Pyle was unsure if the man would survive his wounds or the ordeal, but Flight Lieutenant Robert Gordon Lee survived the war. Ernie Pyle also spent some time on an aircraft carrier in the South Pacific in March of '45, and he said in a column something that hit home with me as a former crewman aboard an aircraft carrier in the mid-'50s. He was explaining how Navy pilots were brought in by a landing signal officer, which has been done away with now. They use lighting systems. And how difficult it was to land, even under the best of conditions. And this is what Pyle wrote in that story. He says, landing on the deck of a small carrier in a rough sea is just about like landing on a half a block of Main Street while a combined hurricane and earthquake is going on. That's a pretty damn good description. Carrier pilots I knew always referred to landings as controlled crashes, and that's about what they were. In the peace of 1956, our ship lost 7 crewmen in aircraft accidents in a 6-month period. This is in peacetime. And in the fall of that year, as part of the U.S. Sixth Fleet, 27 combat vessels stood on station about 40 miles north of the canal while the Suez Crisis fight developed just over the horizon, with the British and the French and the English, as you know, invading Egypt. It was a 30-day case of nerves, not knowing if we would be attacked by the Egyptians or knowing if we would get involved in that fight somehow. I had problems. I asked our assistant division officer who he thought, if we did get involved, who would we be fighting against? He said, why do you want to know? I said, I've got cousins in the British Armed Forces. And he said, I doubt if it would be Great Britain. They were sounding general quarters almost every day, mainly because we were picking up planes coming out from the beach on radar. And the whole idea was just very frightening to everybody on board. But nobody was shooting at us. We were not in battle. And 30 days on station at sea is a short time compared to World War II troops who spent, in some cases, years in theater. There's another group I haven't mentioned, and I consider them among the bravest of the brave. They are the men, and in some cases, a few cases, the women, who became prisoners of war. They not only faced combat, but they also suffered through that very uncertain days of confinement in a POW camp, not knowing whether they would die from lack of food or from freezing or from wounds or at the hands of a vicious guard or even from misdirected Allied bombs. There were in World War II about 130,000 American soldiers, airmen, Marines, and sailors were prisoners of the enemy. So 95,000 of that number were in German hands. Those captured by the Germans had a better survival rate than those taken by the Japanese. The death rate of Americans held in Japanese camps was 10 times greater than that of prisoners in German camps. Across the world, many prisoners of all nations did not survive, and many faced continuing physical and mental problems after their rescue and return home. And that's true of my friend Harry Fritz. The death rate of Americans in captivity in Europe has been estimated at 4%, far below that of Russian
May
prisoners.
I have your attention, please? This is just a reminder that the Hershey Public Library has begun its summer hours, and we will be closing in half an hour at 8 p.m.
I guess we better
Thank you.
go.
Just for your information, we got a special dispensation. They're going to let us stay in this room till 9 o'clock.
Let me repeat that last sentence. The death rate of Americans in captivity in Europe has been estimated at 4%, far below that of Russian prisoners. It's believed that some 3 million Russian troops died in Nazi hands. According to the authors of a work entitled Prisoners of War and Their Captors in World War II, some 80 million people worldwide were in military service between about 1939 and 1945. And it has been estimated that about 35 million of that 80 million spent at least some time in enemy hands during those 6 years. Now, before you question such a large percentage of prisoners, remember that the Germans captured about the entire French army early on in the summer of 1940, and vast numbers, of course, of Soviet troops in early campaigns on the Eastern Front. In the Pacific theater, large numbers of British Commonwealth troops were compelled to surrender as the Japanese swept through Southeast Asia. And of course, as the Allies began that upward swing in the Mediterranean theater, they penned up more than 500,000 Italians and a significant number of Germans by the summer of 1943. On the Eastern Front, as the fortunes of war began to change, the Soviets bagged entire Axis armies, including 100,000 men in one day from the German 6th Army. Some included in the overall total of World War II prisoners were also those who were captured but escaped rather quickly before they could be moved to a permanent prison camp. Before I get to the story of my special guest I brought here tonight, let me tell one other story of a tail gunner on a B-17 with the 8th Air Force in England. His name was Gerald McDowell, and he wrote a book about his experiences. The story is about one of those horrendous accidents, which really turned out okay for the crew in the long run. His plane was crossing the Ruhr Valley and passing through the flak area en route to the target. Suddenly, the roar of an engine caught McDowell's ear, and his plane lurched to one side. He got a momentary glance of another B-17 on the port side of his ship. Then the pilot yelled over the intercom to his co-pilot, and he said, "Hey, Phallic, that son of a bitch took all of our goddamn wing." McDowell learned later that the other plane had come up through the formation and seemed out of control. Other crewmen who could see out the port side said a prop of that other bomber chewed off 15 feet from the left wing of McDowell's plane. McDowell said he could see cables and wires hanging down and either fuel or hydraulic fluid dripping out. And then he made the understatement of the century. He said, "I felt a little uneasy at the sight." I would too. The pilot decided to turn back before they reached the initial point of the bomb run could make them dog meat for German fighters, which they knew would be waiting outside the flak area. So the pilot adjusted the trim tabs, stayed into formation with 15 feet of his wing gone. Before long, they reached the initial point, turned on target for that straight line in. Then the bombardier threw the switch to open the bomb bay doors, and nothing happened. He kept flipping the switch off and on, nothing. So he says over the intercom, he says, "Okay, I'll come back. I'll drop him right through the doors." And he did. I don't know how technically how it was done, but he dropped them, and the force of those bombs fall and just pushed the doors open. But not all the bombs went out. The radio operator called him, and he said there's a cluster stuck. And he and the engineer tried kicking them out. That didn't work. So, but the bombardier came back, reached out into that 55-degree below zero weather with those doors open, and somehow released that cluster. That's not all. But they made the turn for home, back to England from Germany. Crew was unable to close the bomb bay doors now, either by power switch or hand cranking. And with both pilots fighting the controls, they finally made it back to base at a place called Bassingbourn, England. Of course, then came preparations for landing. Now, I've flown small planes. I've never flown anything like this, but I can imagine what these guys were going through. In order to maintain a level attitude, the pilot poured all the power he could on those two port engines, which, despite the short wing, were still running. Due to the loss of hydraulics, they had difficulty getting the landing gear down, but finally managed that too. And the pilots also knew that they had to keep that tail a bit higher on the approach, because if that tail went down too soon and those bomb bay doors started to dig into that runway, it could flip them over. McDowell, with another understatement, he says it was a rough landing. Yeah. And he said it took almost the entire runway to slow the B-17 down and keep it straight. Of course, the bomb bay doors took a beating on when they finally did hit the runway. And that section of wing that was gone didn't help anything. And so the plane was scrapped. McDowell said, it had been a nice new ship when they took it out. Crew got another ship. This one had just been repaired, including to McDowell's worry. It had 16 bullet holes patched around the tail gunner's position. The plane was named Hell's Bell and was a sister ship to that famous Memphis Belle. You remember the movie, the Memphis Belle? But on its next mission, McDowell and the crew were shot down and became prisoners of war. I have here with me tonight copies of 4 books which you can examine after the meeting on a table over there, and if you wish purchase them. One is Days of Darkness, Gettysburg Civilians, a Civil War book, obviously. Story of what happened to the people of Gettysburg during and after the battle. Heroes Among Us, which may interest any of you who were in the Navy. This is really a novel, but I wrote about my own experiences on board ship. If any of you have relatives, or if you're from up in the coal regions of Pennsylvania, Coal King Slaves is about what life was for a typical family in the 1890s up in the Scranton area. And the book we're most proud of tonight just came out last August, Rescue from Ploesti, the Harry Fritz story. This is a story, of course, about another tail gunner. This one aboard a B-24 Liberator with the 15th Air Force out of Italy. Harry had many close calls too. In a few minutes, I'm going to ask him to step up here to answer any questions you might have and tell you anything he may want to tell you. And he might even sing you a song while he was in prison for something to do. The prisoners in his camp wrote a song about what was going on to the tune of the Wabash Cannonball. And I've only heard 1 or 2 verses, and I understand that some of the verses are not fit for a family newspaper. Harry had just turned 21 a few weeks before his 19th combat mission. Twice before, he had been to one of the three most dangerous targets in Europe, that immense ring of oil refineries, 11 of them altogether, in and around the city of Ploeste in southern Romania, from which the Germans at that time were getting a fully 1/3 of the oil supplies they needed for everything in their field. Ploeste had what other targets had, a mammoth defense network. There were 8 air fighter bases in the region within short distance, at least 100 anti-aircraft guns on the ground, 100 barrage balloons tethered to the ground with steel cables. There were 2,000 huge smoke pots which could blot out the entire target from the side of a bombardier. And around every building was a brick wall, a blast wall, to prevent a direct hit on one building from taking out the next building with a domino effect. Those walls were as high as 20 feet. Some were 6 feet wide at the bottom and 2 feet at the top. Actually, there were 2 rings of defenses at Ploeste, an inner ring from the refineries out to 4 miles, and a secondary ring which extended out 22 miles. So the Germans had a great interest in protecting this place because this is part of their lifeline. In addition, they had built 2 fake Ploeste towns, one 6 miles west and the other about 6 miles east of the real Ploeste. One to the east was designed for night attacks because they had lights there which resembled refinery buildings. There were no buildings, just lights making it look like a refinery. And they had an oil pool which they could light to make bombers think that they had hit a target and the target was burning. The Ploeste oil field refineries at this point were capable of putting out 700,000 tons of oil products every month. 700,000 tons. Well, on that final mission, Harry Fritz's plane had dropped its bombs and was turning back towards home, towards Italy. Suddenly, the number 1 engine quit. Then the number 3 caught fire. One of the 2 remaining engines began to act up too. Now, you could fly a B-24 on 2 engines, but you couldn't fly it fast enough to keep up with the formation, and therefore become a sitting duck for any fighters in the area. Next, a gas tank took a hit, and fuel began spewing out behind one of the wings. Then shrapnel hit the nose, seriously wounded the navigator in the chest, and also wounding the bombardier and the nose gunner. On the intercom, the pilot announced that his controls were not responding well. He was having problems trying to turn or bank or climb. Pieces of metal from a supercharger on one engine were flying back and striking the waist of the plane. Then the intercom failed. The engineer crawled back to Harry in the tail, told him to move up to the waist and prepare to bail out. And within minutes, that decision was changed. The new plan was to head east rather than west to try and land in territory controlled by the Russians. So Harry was ordered back to his tail gun position. And as he was crawling, he could hear bullets striking the plane someplace. When he got back to that bubble, he found that the shield around his seat was shot full of holes. If he had been sitting there, he would have been shot full of holes too.
May I have your attention, please? The Hershey Public Library will be closing in approximately 15 minutes at 8 p.m. If you would like to check out any materials this evening, or if you have any questions concerning your library card account, please come to the circulation desk at this time. Thank you.
I'll be done in 2 minutes. It was the first of 3 times that same day when Harry Fritz thought he might die. Then came another order telling him to return to the waist again. The pilot knew he could not make it to Russian territory. He was losing altitude rapidly. He was down to 6,000 feet by then. doubted that they could even make a crash landing successfully. So he gave the order, bail out. Harry went out through the small hatch in the belly of the plane. He had never parachuted before. I never knew this, but in World War II air crews in boot camp learned basically how to pull the ripcord, hang on to the straps, and hope or pray for a successful landing. But they never actually jumped. So this was his first time in a parachute. Then came his second fear of death. As he floated to earth, he could hear bullets whizzing up past him. Somebody on the ground was obviously trying to shoot him, perhaps with a rifle. But they missed, though not by very much, and either gave up or ran out of ammunition. After he hit the ground, he could no longer see the plane nor any other parachutes. He was all alone. But he soon saw two figures moving through some nearby woods, and he recognized them as the co-pilot and the waist gunner. After 18 hours of avoiding capture, this trio was finally hemmed in by 4 Romanian peasants threatening them with pitchforks. Again, for the third time, Harry thought he was going to die, stabbed to death on foreign soil by men with pitchforks. Now, you have to remember that back then, air crews were told if you had a choice on capture, take the military, don't take the civilians, because the civilians are liable to execute you. I mean, their reasoning was obvious. You know, you bombed our homes, you bombed our offices, you bombed our workshops, you killed part of my family, and they would execute you. These 3 men didn't have a choice, but fortunately, these Romanian peasants or farmers did turn them over to the Germans. And Harry and the rest of the crew began new life as prisoners of war. Harry, Fritz, and about 1,100 Allied airmen, mostly Americans, were eventually rescued in a daring mission by B-17s from the 15th Air Force, which were landing almost in enemy territory because the Germans weren't far away, over a 3-day period at an abandoned airport near Bucharest. And they were just coming in. They weren't even shutting down their engines. They were taking maybe 20 guys, throwing them literally in the back of that B-17 and off again. Fighter aircraft overhead providing cover. And they got, except for one man who was so badly injured, they had to keep him in Bucharest in a hospital until he could get him out later. Except for that one man, every one of those 1,100 guys were pulled out of there. It was a very dramatic thing. And we talk about that in this book. At last, Harry and those other men were escaping the horrors of war. It's an honor to introduce you to former Staff Sergeant Harry Fritz. And like I said, he may sing you a song if you're lucky.
I'm not going to be as long as Bill. But he knows the story. The Rescue from Wesley book that Bill wrote really brings out more than facts. But the one thing I want to mention, the most devastating thing that happened to me was the Russians freed us in prison. They came in one evening and announced that we were free. Well, this made the Germans mad. They had an airport out 20, Colonel Gunn said 20 miles out from Boeste, from our prison camp, which was really in Bucharest. And this made them mad, and they came over and they bombed and bombed and bombed and bombed and skip bombed the prison camp. We were free. And one fellow told me I had dysentery and I was at the breaking point and I didn't know what to do. And he said, go to a 14-story cement building and you'll be safe. And I went to this 14-story building and I think I was safe. But there were civilians in there. And when they'd see the Germans coming and skip bombing and strafing, they'd run back and forth and scream and yell. I had dysentery. I was at the breaking point, and I just didn't know what to do. I went in a corner. I can't do it because of my arthritis, but I sat down and put my head in between my legs and knees and prayed to God. And God must have had something else in mind for me because I'm still here. I'm not going to talk as long as Bill Williams talked, but I will share with you our prison camp song. One of the prisoners wrote this song, and it's the Bucharest Cannonball. Across the Adriatic, through spacious skies of blue, there came 1,000 bombers with airmen tried and true. They headed through the Balkans and straight for Bucharest. But when they hit the Black Alley, the gunners did the rest. Now they all landed safely with parachutes galore. And now they're in a prison camp, sweating out the war. We thought the war was over, but bombers, they still flew. We heard the roar of engines as they passed overhead. We lay there a-praying and praying very hard that they would miss the city and hit the marshalling yards. Thank you very much.
Harry said he'd take a few questions if you fellas and gals have any for him.
Yeah.
Right here.
When were you shot down?
Pardon?
When were you shot down? What date? The day that you were shot down?
What day?
Yeah.
I can't just tell you which day that was. It was one of our missions. I went over Pulaski 3 times, and the 3rd time I came back by the way of a prison camp. And it's very fortunate. It was the hardest target in Europe, really. And they had smoke bombs, and you couldn't find out where you were bombing and so forth. And in all of it, they went in, the Americans thought they could go out at low level, there's another name for it, but anyway, they went in treetop level, and they thought they could go in and they could knock out the rest of the oil fields in one shot. That didn't work. So then they had to go back, and we went back, and we went back, and we flew at 24,000 feet or thereabout, and just kept pounding and pounding and pounding and pounding, and finally we knocked it out. And once we knocked out the rest of the oil fields, I think the war was almost over, because they had no gas for their trucks, they had no gas for their tanks, they had no gas for their airplanes, so they had no offense. They didn't even have any defense at all. They didn't have anything. And I think really the war was over. And of course, prisoners, one thing I want to bring out, I don't know if there's any prisoners in there. I know Frank was a prisoner.
May I have your attention, please?
But,
The Hershey Public Library will be closing in 5 minutes at 8 p.m.
You're interrupting me.
If you would like to check out any materials this evening, you must do so at this time. Please be aware that we are in the process of turning off our equipment to ensure a prompt closing at 8 p.m. Thank you and have a very pleasant evening.
But it does a lot to a prisoner of war when he gets free and gets home. I was a confused person when I came home. I was a drunk. I went out and drank every day. I went down to the gas station and kidded with the guys in the morning, and about that time I'd get dressed up and cleaned up and go out and drink. And I loved my mother, and I had a good mother. And my mother says, now you either straighten out or you get out. Lisi, and for breakfast. I remember that. And some people say I was flying out of Fuji, and it's always been a little confusing to me where I really flew out of. But Barry was the headquarters for the
Okay.
54th.
Sorry, yeah.
But Lisi, I know I went into town and used to get breakfast in the morning.
Yeah.
So I almost think that I flew out of Lisi.
Lecce,
Lisi. Lisi's
in
way.
the south.
It's really way down on the hill.
Yeah, but I was at Brindisi. I finished up at Barry, but I was at Foggia for quite a while. But that was all B-17s around Foggia.
Well, you flew in a good version.
I was with the British Air Force.
That man will confirm that B-17s are better than the 24.
Well,
There was advantages in the B-24 in the fact that they could carry a bigger bomb load, and they could travel farther because they had bigger tanks for gas, and they could travel farther. But a B-17 had better structure. They could glide and everything. They could get home with less engines than the B-24. Yeah. Any other questions?
Anybody else?
How long were you a prisoner?
9 months.
In the back, Jack.
Did your crew have a name for your plane at all? We hear about them taking a long time.
Did you have a name for your plane?
Oh, that's another story. We took a brand new airplane out of America and flew over to Dakar, Africa. Brand new plane that would be ours whenever we went on a mission. And from Dakar, Africa, we went to Tunis, Africa. And of course, I being a tail gunner, I didn't see what was going on in front. But anyway, our pilot went down a runway that had 50-gallon drums on it. Knocked the nose wheel off. Plane was like this. I'm telling you, when we jumped out the back hatch, we could have broke a leg. But anyway, that was the end of the plane. They shuttled us up to Italy, and then they gave us any darn plane they didn't want. Well, we came back sometimes with only 30 gallons of gas in our tanks. And so we flew with any doggone plane that they didn't want. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
You said you were, the Russians told you you were free, and you're still in the encampment, that's the prison encampment.
She said
What about the living conditions, your food, how you're fed?
when the Russians said you were free, what did you do for food, your living conditions, when they said you were free?
What about your
Well,
clothes and your bunks?
Basically, we only had bread and water. There was something like a soup they called, but I never saw a piece of meat in it. It may have been cooked in a soup bone or something, but it never had any meat in it. And so you actually were on bread and water. And they had something like a tea. It was red. And my engineer always called it hydraulic fluid. Yeah.
And you had that 3 times a day, or just 1 time a day?
What?
3 times a day or once a day?
Oh, I think we got it in the morning and about noon. That's it, about 2. You lost weight every day. You lost some weight. Yeah. And not only did we get bombed by the Germans, in my song, it brings out the fact that the Americans went over our prison camp to get to the marshalling yards. And so we had an air raid every day. And if the Americans dropped their bombs before they were supposed to, they would have hit us. But so we had an air raid every day, and it was scary. But unfortunately, they never dropped any bombs on our prison camp.
What about your sleeping conditions?
What about your sleeping conditions?
Well, the first night I slept on straw on a cement floor. And the bad thing about sleeping or anything in there, we were lousy. I mean, we had lice. We would sit out, a staff sergeant on up. The Geneva Convention says that you don't have to work. And we didn't have to work. But we would sit out in the stockade and just pick this lice out. I'm telling you, we were lousy. And they bite, too. Yeah. Yeah.
What about your medical? How about the ones that were
Medical
sick?
help.
We didn't have it. Oh, that's another thing. When I was at my breaking point, and I was in this 14-story building, I had dysentery. And you may not believe this if any of you are medical people, but a fellow told me, and because we were freed at that time, we had access to bread. And he told me, like people take communion, they take a piece of bread and eat it. He says, you take the bread and just keep eating and eating and eating and eating. And when I got in the plane to fly me out of there, the dysentery left me. I guess everything was out, and plus the fact I blocked it up. But that's against medical things, because I'm sure that if you went to a doctor and had dysentery, he wouldn't tell you to go and eat a loaf of bread. But it worked.
How did you find out that you were going to be rescued and brought back?
How did you find out you were going to be rescued and brought back?
Oh. Well, there was a Colonel Gunn. Oh, when we were freed, there was a Colonel Gunn over there that was a prisoner of war. I knew him personally, because when you were a prisoner, rank didn't mean anything. We were all one group. You supported each other. But anyway, Colonel Gunn got in an ME-109 with the Romanians had an ME-109. I don't think he could fly it, and they got him in the plane. And he knew where the 15th Air Force was, and they painted an American flag on the ME-109, and somehow or other maybe radioed and told the 15th Air Force that they were coming, and they didn't shoot at them, and they landed, and they got the 15th Air Force to come over and bomb this little airport that was beating us. The Germans had 20 miles out. They knocked that out, and once they knocked that out, we were clear. Some of them went to town and so forth that were able, but I wasn't because I had dysentery. But anyway, so then he went back again and got the B-17s in to fly us out. And we got back to Italy, and they took us in like in a stockade and disrobed you and burned all your clothes because you were lousy, and they, like you dust potatoes and so forth, they put it up your rectum and all your under your arms and so forth, and so then we were ready to go home.
Were you all together in one area? What about these people that spread out? I mean, did all the prisoners spread out? I mean, how did they get in one area to get the planes, to load them up in the planes and get them out of there? They were in different
She
locations.
said if you were all spread out over an area, how did they get you all together to get on the planes?
But we basically we were still in the prison camp.
Let me clarify that situation
Well,
for
don't
you. I'll do it anytime. What happened when the Russians were coming from the east, the Germans started to retreat, and they moved to the north about 20 miles, turning the prison camp over to Romanian guards. Well, about that time, the Romanian government decided we're on the wrong side, and they changed from the Axis to the Allied side. Well, when that happened, the Romanian guards left the camp. So these 1,100 guys are in a camp. There's no guards. But where are they going to go? They're separated from Italy by the Adriatic Sea. They're behind German lines, in effect. When the Germans weren't that far away. And some of them went into the city of Bucharest, And the people there, the civilians, were not much better shape than they were. They didn't have any food or medicine. So these guys had nothing. So they went back to the camp and just tried to wait.
Yeah, Romania's a very poor place. I mean, all the oil that they have and everything. And you know, another thing I would like to mention is we had a Romanian reunion each year. And who started this? I got a letter from a Princess Kojar. She was a Romanian prince. And she wrote me a letter, and I wondered, who the heck is Princess Kojar? But anyway, she organized the Romanian reunions, and we still have them if you're able to go. But she organized that, and she would get on a lectern, and she would say, look, you have to fight for freedom. Don't let them take freedom away. And she had a broken accent, but she was a well-educated person.
All the way in the back, Eric.
Yeah, I had two questions, and I don't know which one you want to answer. One was the target actually the refinery or the train tracks leading to the refinery?
Was the target the refinery itself or the train tracks leading to the refinery?
Oh, no, it was a refinery.
It was refinery.
Yeah. You could see the tanks and everything. Oh, yeah, it was a refinery.
The other is, I don't know if you can answer this, I've interviewed a lot of POWs who when they returned to America and they found out how the Germans were treated, which were rather nicely, they were fairly upset. I was wondering if when you came back to America, if you had any knowledge of how the German POWs were treated in America.
No, I didn't. No. But,
Hey, could you tell us your training you went through, like your indoctrination, where you were stationed here in the United States before you went overseas?
Where were you trained in the States before you went overseas?
By any chance?
oh, so many places.
Kingsman,
We
Arizona?
we went Amarillo, Texas. Any number. They took you up in an AT-6 and you shot at a sleeve with a 30 caliber machine gun and any number of things. And I was the armament gunner, and I had to. They say I hardly believe it, but that you had to take a 50 caliber machine gun apart and put it together blindfolded. So we had a lot of training, and Bill brings out in the book, if you wanted to duck getting into the war or going into combat, all you had to do is fail some of these tests, because we had a lot of training in many phases, and we had to learn how to fix a bomb bay, the mechanism in the bomb bay and so forth. So we got a lot of training, and it spent a lot of time. I even have a song about that, how we used to march around just to get passes to go into town and so forth. Anything else?
Let me say one other thing. It's been 60 years ago, and this gentleman every day still takes a walk around his neighborhood just to feel free.
That's
So
true.
you never get over the effects of that.
And you never get overnight, man.
And I was going to mention that too. He still has nightmares about this.
And you know, today, after World War II, we thought we really accomplished things and things were peaceful. And today, things are so complex that it's beyond my comprehension of what's going on in Iraq. And I don't have answers, but it's very confusing to me of the things that are going on in Iraq, and Afghanistan, and Bosnia. We're all over the world, and I just can't see that we're going to come out ahead. I don't know, but it's beyond my comprehension, and I hope somebody understands what's going on. Okay?
So ST was the hardest target, and of course that's the one which you went down over. Were there any other targets which you flew which you have memories of as far as, because
Any other targets that you have memories of besides Ploesti?
Well, Ploesti was the one that stood out because I went over 3 times. And I have a little red book at home of all the little targets I went to. But they didn't have the heavy flak that Ploesti had. Ploesti, if you got through Ploesti, it was a miracle. Yeah. And I'll never forget, I saw an ME-101, ME-109 out there one day, and I shot at it, and I think I got it. And the guys, we had a good crew, except they went down and run over 50-gallon drums. But anyway, they all came over and says, "Harry, you did great. You got an ME-109." And so there's so many little incidents, and I can't emphasize it enough. Bill has done a wonderful job on this rescue from Ploesti to Harry Fritz story. It really brings out so many things. We got together for a couple months, and talked about this. And so I would suggest you buy it. It's $12.95.
Just the commercial now.
Well, I had to read on to it.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
One thing Harry mentioned that I just found out about a year ago. He mentioned he's a staff sergeant, and that he didn't have to work because staff sergeants and above under the Geneva Convention, all the flight crews, once the United States Army Air Corps found this out, all the flight crews were staff sergeants or above. There were no more corporals and private first classes flying airplanes. Yeah, I got to pass the hat, but I wanted to tell you, as you heard her say, the library's closing at 8 o'clock in July and in August, and won't be back to 9 o'clock hours until September. So we're going to do what we did last summer. We're going to go out to Fort Indiantown Gap to the community club for July and August. Next month, our speaker is a gentleman who was a sergeant at the Nuremberg War Trials. And then in August, those of you who were here will remember General Frank Smoker, who flew B-17s over Germany. He'll be our speaker in August. And we're going to have that co-sponsored by the Keystone chapter of the Association of the United States Army. And we may have some refreshments out there because they've got a budget. Yes, sir.
Can I make a couple of observations? Somebody raised a question about how we treated the German prisoners of war.
Yes,
I
sir.
can't speak for the Germans, but I can certainly tell you locally from the Italians. If you go down to Letterkenny Army Depot, you're going to see a very pretty little chapel down there. It was built by the Italian prisoners of war. America wasn't being bombed. We had food and we fed these guys. We clothed them. We took darn good care of them. If you played golf and you go down to a place called the Chenverly in Newmarket, Virginia, the main building housed Italian diplomats. They lived like kings. We treated them pretty well, but we had the opportunity to do so. That's the American way.
Well, those of you who don't know me, I'm Bill Jackson. I own the local newspaper, and there were a number of Italian prisoners here locally over in the New Cumberland area. And these guys got terribly lonely. And as you know, Hershey has a very large Italian-American community. And they asked members of the Italian community to go over and visit with these guys. And, apparently it was a great situation where they went over. And there was one marriage resulted out of it, and I've been trying for 10 years to find out who it was, and I can't find out. But there was one of the Hershey girls married one of the Italian POWs that was over here. Sir?
That's an interesting question. When the Italians switched sides, so to speak, what, 44, 43
Yeah.
or something, were these prisoners released then or still held as...
No, I think they were still held, as far as I know.
Sure, they were still treated as...
Yeah,
POWs.
yeah.
I think the problem, if I can interject, there was, they couldn't release them right away because there was no place to send them. They couldn't go home.
Yeah. Does everybody know where the community club is out at Fort Indiantown Gap?
No.
Okay.
Bill, I think it'd be a good idea if you, on the thing that you distribute, put a map in there.
We'll put a little postcard, on the postcard, we'll try and put some directions on it. But, Eric, you have something?
I just wanted to say the reason I asked the question about the POWs, to be honest with you, there's two issues there. One is that a lot of the POWs were down in the South, and there was a lot of resentment that a white German or Italian could eat at a place that a black American could.
Right.
So that's an interesting side story in itself. The second was there's at least maybe 24 incidences of when American GIs came back who were held as prisoners of war and had to guard German prisoner of wars in America, the Germans being unaccounted for. So, I mean, I thought we did a great job. We were generous. We were magnificent. But, that after, some of these folks came back, there was obvious frustrations that were vented. So that was the reason I asked. And it's an interesting issue to study. And I was just talking about the German POWs and not the Italian.
Yes, Mr. Evans.
The German POWs, there were a lot of them in Indiantown.
Right.
And they used to bring them into a apple orchard just north of Palmyra. They'd bring them in there to pick apples. And that went on for a couple of years with the POWs. And a couple of those guys married local girls.
Very local girls.
How about the ones who were up at the hotel?
Oh, well, yeah,
Under the French.
yeah, we had one of you fellows that haven't been coming in a while, one of our early on talks. When the war started, of course, when we got into it after Pearl Harbor, the Vichy French government was on the side of the Germans, and they interned their entire embassy in Washington, D.C. at the Hotel Hershey. Built a fence around it, and they were there for about 2 years until they were exchanged for American diplomats that had been interned in Europe.
Well, you talk about building a fence around it. It wasn't much of a fence.
No, that's very
Because
true.
They played golf, and you used to meet
Yeah.
them over at the ballroom. They'd be in there
They
Saturday night.
They
dancing.
essentially could walk away, and nobody really did
Yeah.
much about it.
There wasn't much.
And I've talked to some of the old timers in Hershey and said they were the most arrogant bunch of SOBs you'd ever want to meet.
Why would they want to walk away? They just stayed there. That had to be.
Anybody else? Something for the good of the order. Well, I want as you know, we don't collect dues, so we pass the helmet. So I'll start that around. And